Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Now imagine this. You are at work. You're closing up shop on what seemed like a normal day, and suddenly 3 men walk in. They're armed, and they're also determined to rob the place. But this isn't a simple robbery. Oh no, what unfolds is something so brutal, so sadistic, it leaves a community shaken and a nation horrified. This is the story of the Hi-Fi murders, one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in Utah's history. It happened on April 22nd, back in 1974, at a small electronics store in Ogden. A robbery turned into a night of unimaginable torture, violence, and death. 5 people taken hostage, and only 2 survived, scarred forever by what they endured. What makes this case even more chilling is the dynamic between the perpetrators. At the center was Dale Selby Pierre, the leader of the group, whose influence over his accomplices, William Andrews and Keith Roberts, drove the night's horrors. Andrews followed Pierre's orders without hesitation, while Roberts, though less involved, played a key role in the planning. Their actions left behind a trail of devastation that still echoes decades later. So why did this happen? How does one person exert so much control over others that they will commit acts of unspeakable violence? And where do we draw the line between influence and personal responsibility? Stick with me here as we dive into this haunting case, and together we'll explore the details of that horrific night, the legal aftermath, and the questions that still linger. Who truly bears the blame? And could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? Let's unpack it all and see if justice was truly served. The Hi-Fi murders were not just about a robbery gone wrong. Let's be clear about that. They were about something much darker, an exploration of the human capacity for violence, influence, and control. At the center of this chilling case lies a question that still haunts many. How does one person gain so much control over others that they commit acts they might never have otherwise considered on their own? Dale Selby Pierre, the ringleader, was not just an ordinary criminal. He was a man who seemed to revel in sadism, orchestrating the violence with a terrifying sense of purpose. His accomplices, William Andrews and Keith Roberts, were not strangers to him. They were fellow airmen at Hill Air Force Base. But while they shared camaraderie, their roles in this horrific crime differed significantly, shaped by Pierre's overwhelming influence. Andrews, described by some as a follower, took part in the torture and murders. He didn't hesitate when Pierre gave orders, carrying out instructions with chilling compliance. Keith Roberts, on the other hand, remained outside the building. He served as a lookout, and while his role was less direct, his involvement in the planning and enabling of this crime raised questions about where the line of accountability begins and ends. As the crime unfolded, it became clear that this was not an impulsive act. This was meticulously planned, with the perpetrators bringing items like Drano, which they forced the hostages to drink, believing it would kill them quickly. And when that did not work as planned, the violence escalated. This level of brutality was orchestrated by Pierre, but the complicity of his accomplices adds a disturbing layer to this case. And it leads to the central question: was this simply the work of a sadistic mastermind, or does the blame extend equally to his accomplices who followed his lead? Were Andrews and Roberts victims of Pierre's influence, or did they share an equal hand in the horrors of that night? And beyond the legal verdicts, how does society reconcile the role of influence in acts of extreme violence? These questions form the backbone of today's case. As we explore the Hi-Fi murders, we'll dissect the dynamics between the perpetrators and examine how one person's influence can turn a crime into something unimaginably horrific. Stick with me here because this is a story that will leave you questioning everything about the nature of responsibility and control. Okay, to understand the role of influence in the Hi-Fi murders, we need to dig into the psychological dynamics of the perpetrators. Dale Selby Pierre was not just the planner of this crime, he was its architect, motivator, and executor. His personality loomed large over his accomplices, William and Keith, and this power imbalance raises key questions about accountability. Pierre was known to be confident, aggressive, and commanding, a stark contrast to William Andrews. Andrews was described by colleagues as reserved and quiet. The question is, how did Pierre's dominance over Andrews shape that night? Was Andrews acting out of fear, loyalty, or something deeper? A need to seek approval from someone he perceived as a leader? And then let's not forget about Keith Roberts, the lookout. Roberts' physical distance from the horrific acts inside the Hi-Fi shop did not absolve him of complicity in the eyes of the law. But morally, where does his guilt lie? Did his willingness to be involved stem from Pierre's manipulation? Or was it simply opportunistic and greed? These are the kinds of questions that make this case so difficult to unravel. And then, of course, let's talk about the victims. The Hi-Fi shop was supposed to close at 6 p.m. that night, but things didn't go as planned for store employees Stanley Walker and Michelle Ainsley, or the bystanders who walked into this unfolding nightmare. What was their experience of Pierre and his accomplices? The hostages later revealed how Pierre commanded every moment of violence. Andrews, however, carried out his role with chilling detachment, following Pierre's lead. And what's even more unsettling is how meticulously planned this robbery was. This group did not just walk in with weapons. They brought items designed specifically for torture. The Drano, which they thought would kill their victims instantly, ended up only causing unimaginable suffering instead. Who conceptualized this? It is no surprise Pierre was at the helm, but did his accomplices push back? And if they did not, was that because of fear or something darker, like maybe shared intent? As we dig deeper into this case, the moral questions only multiply. How far can we blame influence when individuals still have free will? Was Pierre's dominance enough to absolve Andrews and Roberts of their roles? Or does following orders only compound their guilt? This is always a difficult question. If any one of us had a gun to our head, we would most likely try to comply so that we could get out of the situation and hopefully try to make what we could right. But then when the situation's over, you did comply, and it could put you in a situation like this. We haven't gone over anything else yet, but I want to pause and consider that's how tricky this gets. If you did have to comply to save your own life, would it look that way on the outside? It's not that easy to determine as an outsider. When we talk about influence in crimes like the Hi-Fi murders, we're often looking for a moment where that line blurs, when a suggestion becomes an order, and when compliance turns into complicity. For Dale Selby Pierre, control was not just about barking orders. It was about creating a dynamic where resistance seemed impossible, or worse, unnecessary. William Andrews' role is especially haunting. Okay, because here's a man who, according to testimony, didn't hesitate when Pierre instructed him to administer the Drano. Yet when questioned later, Andrews claimed he did not enjoy this violence and that he was merely following Pierre's lead. But does that explanation hold up? After all, following orders does not erase moral responsibility, does it? Then, of course, there's the planning phase. Andrews and Roberts both knew the robbery was coming, and they both agreed to be a part of it. But did they realize how brutal it would become? Pierre's track record suggested he was no stranger to criminal behavior, and his plan wasn't exactly subtle. Drano was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was premeditated. Did Andrews and Roberts convince themselves that this was going to be just a robbery? Or were they complicit from the beginning, knowing full well how violent Pierre's ideas could get? And what about Keith Roberts? His role was less direct, but his actions, or lack thereof, contributed to the outcome. As the lookout, Roberts was not inside the shop when the worst of the violence unfolded. But was his absence a way to distance himself from the crimes, or a calculated move to ensure the plan succeeded? After all, being outside did not mean he was not a part of this. The survivors' accounts also add another layer to this story, of course. They described Pierre as methodical, almost cold in his execution, but they also noticed that Andrew didn't hesitate when given instructions. If Andrews did in fact feel trapped or coerced, why didn't he show any signs of this, any sign of resistance or hesitation? Could it be that Pierre's influence wasn't just fear-driven, but also fueled by a shared sense of purpose among the group? They were doing this because. These questions bring us closer to the heart of the Hi-Fi murders. How much responsibility do we assign to influence? And at what point does following orders become as unforgivable as giving them? As we bring this part of the story to a close, let's return to the central question. How far does influence extend before it becomes indistinguishable from personal responsibility? Was William Andrews simply a man caught in Pierre's web? Or did he knowingly embrace the violence? And what of Keith Roberts? Was his distance from the scene an attempt to avoid guilt, or a deliberate tactic to play his part without getting his hands dirty? Pierre's ability to dominate the situation is very clear, but the legal system didn't just convict him. It held Andrews and Roberts accountable as well, and their sentences sparked heated debate. Was justice served, or were they unfairly punished for falling under Pierre's sway? The public has never reached a consensus. Dale, Selby, Pierre, and William Andrews were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for their roles in the Hi-Fi murders. Pierre was executed by lethal injection back in '87, while Andrews was executed in '92 after years of appeals. Keith Roberts, who acted as the lookout and was not directly involved, was convicted of robbery. He received a 5-year sentence, and this sparked ongoing debate about whether his punishment fit his level of involvement. Again, very tricky. What's undeniable, though, is the sheer brutality of the Hi-Fi murders. The premeditated nature of the violence suggests more than a simple robbery gone wrong. It reveals a calculated cruelty that cannot be ignored. Pierre may have been the mastermind, but without Andrews and Roberts, his plan could never have unfolded like it did. So where does that leave us? Influence is a powerful force, but free will is also a factor. How much of what happened that night can be attributed to Pierre's manipulation? And how much reflects the choices of Andrews and Roberts themselves? With these questions lingering, let's move to the next layer of this case, the cold, hard facts of what happened inside the Hi-Fi shop. The details are harrowing, but they're essential to understand the full weight of this crime. The Hi-Fi murders unfolded, as I said, in April of '74 at a small electronics store in Ogden, Utah, called the Hi-Fi shop. What started as a robbery quickly devolved into one of the most brutal crimes in Utah's history. Dale, Selby, Pierre, William Andrews, and Keith Roberts, all airmen from Hill Air Force Base. They arrive at the shop that evening, and they have a plan. Steal expensive equipment, eliminate any witnesses, and walk away without a trace. But what actually happened was far more horrifying. Pierre and Andrews entered the shop around closing time, brandishing firearms. They quickly subdued Stanley Walker, who was a store employee. They forced him into the basement. Another employee, Michelle Ainsley, was also captured and taken downstairs. Keith Roberts remained outside, stationed as the lookout, while Pierre and Andrews controlled the scene inside. As the robbery progressed, unlucky passerbys stumbled into the chaos. First came Byron Courtney, a teenage boy who was simply looking for his friend Stanley. Then came Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, who had stopped by to check on his son. Both were taken hostage and forced into the basement with the others. And what happened next was sheer horror. Pierre produces a bottle of Drano, forces the hostages to drink it. He believes it will kill them quickly, but it did not work as planned. Instead of killing them, it caused excruciating burns and complete agony. Well, for Pierre, that was just frustrating. So he resorted to other methods of torture, including strangulation and shootings, in his attempt to kill the hostages. In total, 3 people were murdered that day: Stanley Walker, Michelle Ainsley, and Byron Courtney. 2 survivors, Orrin Walker and Courtney Nesbitt, were left with life-altering injuries and scars, both physical and emotional. Pierre and Andrews fled the scene, leaving behind a gruesome trail of suffering. The community was left reeling. The calculated violence of the crime, combined with the specific methods used, shocked even seasoned investigators. When Pierre and Andrews were arrested shortly after, the evidence, stolen goods, eyewitness accounts, and their own confessions made their guilt undeniable. But questions about roles of each man and their accountability for the violence persisted, sparking debates that still continue to this day. And then, of course, we have the aftermath. This brought even more shocking details to light. Investigators discovered that the robbery had been meticulously planned, with Pierre and Andrews selecting the hi-fi shop as their target weeks in advance. They gathered not only firearms, but also the Drano, duct tape, and ropes, items clearly intended for more than just intimidation. Their plan was straightforward: subdue the employees, steal expensive equipment, and eliminate witnesses. As the events in the basement unfolded, the brutality escalated. Pierre and Andrews forced each hostage to drink that Drano, using a plastic straw to funnel the corrosive liquid into their mouths. The victims suffered intense chemical burns to their lips, inside their throats, inside their stomachs. It left them writhing in agony. But when this didn't kill them as quickly as Pierre had expected or wanted, he grew impatient. So he shot Stanley Walker and Byron Courtney, execution style. Michelle Ainsley was also fatally shot, while Courtney Nesbitt was strangled with a cord and then left for dead. But there were survivors. Orrin Walker, who had been forced to drink Drano and he'd been shot. He miraculously survives because he pretended to be dead. And you have Courtney, who also survived despite severe injuries, including brain damage from being strangled. Their testimonies would later play a critical role in bringing Pierre and Andrews to justice. The crime scene was a gruesome tableau that left seasoned detectives stunned. Drano burns stained the floor and blood pooled around the victims. The calculated cruelty of the acts made it clear that this was more than a robbery. It was a crime fueled by malice and cold-blooded indifference. When Pierre and Andrews were apprehended, their calm demeanor shocked investigators. Evidence found on their possession linked them directly to the crime, including stolen items from the shop. Andrews initially denied involvement, but later admitted he was at the scene. Pierre, meanwhile, showed zero remorse, further cementing his reputation as the ringleader. As the details emerged, this case captivated the nation. sparking outrage and disbelief. How could such calculated cruelty take place in a quiet Utah town? And how much blame lay with Pierre, the clear mastermind, versus Andrew and Roberts, whose roles were still under scrutiny? As the investigation unfolded, the roles of Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts became clearer. Yet the public struggled to reconcile the details with the sheer brutality of the crime. Pierre's dominance over the operation was undeniable. He directed every act of violence, including the use of Drano and the shootings, while Andrew acted as an unquestioning accomplice. Roberts, stationed outside, avoided direct involvement in the murders, but did play a critical role in enabling the crime by serving as the lookout. What shocked investigators here was the methodical nature of this attack. Pierre and Andrews later admitted that the Drano was intended to kill the hostages and quickly, an assumption that proved tragically incorrect. The survivors, Orrin Walker and Courtney Nesbitt, recounted harrowing details of the night, describing Pierre's calculated cruelty and Andrews' silent compliance. Nesbitt, who suffered permanent brain damage, became a living testament to the horror of that night. The evidence presented in court was overwhelming. Items stolen from the shop were found in the possession of the suspects, and forensic analysis confirmed their involvement. Survivor testimonies painted a grim picture of Pierre's leadership and Andrew's willingness to follow. While Robert's role was less direct, his participation in the planning and execution of the robbery led to his conviction as an accomplice. The trial brought a sense of closure to the community, but the debate over accountability lingered. Were Andrews and Roberts victims of Pierre, or did they willingly participate? This was one of the most brutal crimes Utah had ever seen, and people were confused. The questions still remain at the heart of this case. It's decades later. As the trial began, the prosecution and defense presented starkly different narratives about the events of that night and the roles each defendant played. For the prosecution, the case was clear. Dale Selby Pierre, William Andrews, and Keith Roberts had meticulously planned the robbery and acted with cold, calculated brutality. The evidence was undeniable, and the survivors' testimonies painted a horrifying picture of Pierre's dominance and Andrews' compliance. The prosecution argued that Pierre was the mastermind, orchestrating every act of violence and showing no remorse for his actions. Witnesses testified to his commanding presence and his sadistic enjoyment of the suffering he inflicted. For Andrews, the prosecution's case focused on his active participation in these murders. He may not have devised the plan, but he executed Pierre's orders without hesitation. The use of Drano, the shootings, the deliberate targeting of witnesses, this was all presented as evidence of Andrews' complicity. Keith Roberts' role, as I've mentioned, it was less direct, but the prosecution maintained that his presence as the lookout demonstrated a willingness to enable the crime. Though he didn't enter the store or commit acts of violence, his involvement in the planning phase made him an accomplice under the law. The defense painted a different picture, particularly for Andrews and Roberts. For Andrews, they argued he was acting under Pierre's influence, and he was just too afraid to resist. They described him as a subordinate personality, overwhelmed by Pierre's commanding and manipulative nature. This was a critical argument. Could fear and influence diminish accountability? For Roberts, the defense emphasized that his lack of direct involvement in the violence. They portrayed him as an unwitting participant, unaware of the full extent of Pierre's plan at all. While he served as a lookout, they claimed he had no knowledge that the robbery would be more than a robbery. These opposing narratives set the stage for one of the most polarizing trials in Utah's history. Were Andrews and Roberts coerced participants, or were they willing accomplices? The jury's verdict would reflect their interpretation of these arguments, but for many, the question of influence versus intent remained unsolved. One unique element introduced during this trial was the question of premeditation. The prosecution highlighted how Pierre and Andrews brought items like Drano and duct tape and firearms, arguing that this demonstrated their intent to kill witnesses from the beginning. This contradicted the defense's claims that the murders were just impulsive acts of desperation at the time. The defense for Andrews added that Pierre had a history of coercing others into illegal activities, presenting testimonies from acquaintances who described him as manipulative and intimidating. They argued that this pattern of behavior proved Andrews acted out of fear rather than malice. This nuanced argument introduced a critical question. Can a pattern of manipulation reduce culpability? Or does participation in the crime outweigh personal fears? For Roberts, the defense insisted his absence from the violence demonstrated his intent to avoid bloodshed. But the prosecution countered that his role as lookout was vital to the crime's success. Someone had to be the lookout for the entire crime to happen, tying him to its outcome regardless of his physical distance. Now, okay, let's get into the controversy here. These murders remain one of the most debated crimes in Utah history, and it's not just because of the brutality. It's because also of the questions surrounding the accountability. So there's more going on here, and there are different things we can look at within one crime. At the heart of this controversy is the role of influence. While Pierre was undeniably the mastermind, the extent to which Andrews and Roberts were responsible for the violence, that's where the public opinion diverges. For some, Andrews' compliance was unforgivable. He followed Pierre's orders without visible resistance. He played an active role in the torture and murders of the hostages. Yet others argued that Pierre's manipulative nature and dominance over Andrews made him less culpable. Was Andrews simply too intimidated to resist, or did he share in Pierre's intent? And how can someone from the outside determine this? Roberts' case raised even more questions than that, though. His role as a lookout put him at a physical distance from the crime, complicating it more. His involvement in the planning still made him legally complicit. Critics of his conviction, though, argued that his 5-year sentence was too harsh for someone who didn't participate directly in the violence, while others believed he should have faced even harsher consequences for being there to help enable this robbery that led to such horrific events. The controversy extends beyond the perpetrators to the justice system itself. Pierre and Andrews were both black men. They were sentenced to death by an all-white jury. This adds an entirely new layer. You can see how this crime just stacks up. Black men on trial with an all-white jury? Yeah, you are going to have questions around that. And it did. It raised major concerns about racial bias in this trial. Activists and defense attorneys questioned whether the severity of their sentences was influenced by their race rather than their actions alone. Even decades later, the Hi-Fi murders provoke heated debates about justice and race and the limits of personal accountability. How much blame lies with the individual and how much can be attributed to the influence of others. As we wrap up this journey through the Hi-Fi murders, the questions remain. Where do we draw the line between influence and personal accountability? Was William Andrews truly a victim of Pierre's manipulation? Or was he an equal participant in the horrors that unfolded that night? And what about Keith Roberts? Did his limited role as a lookout diminish his culpability? Or was his involvement essential to the crime's execution? The sentences handed down in this case have divided public opinion since it happened. Pierre and Andrews paid the ultimate price with their executions, but many still debate whether Andrews deserved the same fate as Pierre. And Roberts, on the other hand, served his time and moved on with his life. leaving lingering questions about whether justice was truly served there. And then there's the bigger question. Could this crime have been prevented? What role does society play in recognizing and addressing manipulation and coercion before they lead to such unimaginable violence? Cases like this force us to confront not only the darkness within individuals, but also the systems that fail to intervene before a tragedy takes place. And so now, I turn this case over to you, listeners, as you reflect on the events of that night, the trials and the sentences. Where do you stand? Can you be sure? Was justice served in the Hi-Fi murders? Or do the lingering questions about influence and accountability leave you wondering if we are going to ever have a clear answer? Thank you for staying with me through this case. The Hi-Fi murders challenge us to think about the gray areas in crime and justice. Influence is a powerful force, but accountability cannot be ignored. The law made its ruling, but what about the court of public opinion? Is Andrew's compliance forgivable under the weight of Pierre's dominance? Or does following orders make him just as guilty? Should Roberts, as the lookout, have faced harsher consequences? Or was his limited sentence fair? These are the kind of questions that make true crime so compelling. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity and morality and the justice system. And this case reminds us that these answers are not always black and white, but the conversation they spark are necessary. I'd love to hear your thoughts, what you think about the Hi-Fi murders. Did the legal system get it right? Is there more to this story than the verdicts reveal? Thank you for joining me on another case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there. Stay curious. Ask the hard questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.